It is 7 o'clock. Good to have you with us. Russia must be pushed out of the whole of Ukraine. That from the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, who's called on Western allies to double down on their support for the country with both heavy weapons and air power. And here in Westminster, the Conservatives are facing yet another sex scandal, as a Tory MP is referred to the Parliamentary watchdog over claims that he watched pornography on his mobile phone whilst in the House of Commons chamber. We'll be getting the response of the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace in just a moment. And later this hour, I'll be speaking to the heads of the company that owns the Azovstal steel plant, believed to be the last Ukrainian stronghold in the besieged city of Mariupol, and which is said to be close to catastrophe. It is Thursday, 28th of April. Time for courage, not caution. The Foreign Secretary says Russia must be completely driven out of Ukraine and calls on Western allies to step up their support.
We're doubling down. We will keep going further and faster to push Russia out of the whole of Ukraine.
The United Nations Secretary General is in Kyiv today for talks with Ukraine's president, and we're live here in Moldova, where there are fears that this could be a new front in the war.
Shocking and unacceptable. The Minister for Safeguarding Women tells Sky News that a Conservative MP should be expelled from the party if allegations he watched pornography in the Commons chamber are proved true.
Action needs to be taken. I very much hope that this person will see him out of Parliament, out of the party.
Police raid homes and offices in London and the Isle of Man as part of a criminal investigation into the supply of government PPE. A man is due in court today charged with murdering mother of two, Katie Kenyon, as police continue their search for her. Claims that Johnny Depp lost his role in Pirates of the Caribbean because of the abuse allegations by Amber Heard, as the actor's defamation trial continues. Also ahead on the programme, we'll be speaking to the former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd on whether the United States and China are on a collision course to war. And winner turned giver. We'll speak to the multi-millionaire who's already donated half of her £150 million fortune because she's addicted to helping. Morning all. The Foreign Secretary says Western allies must double down on support for Ukraine and push Russia out of the whole of the country. Liz Truss has also called on Western allies to send tanks, planes and other heavy weapons to Ukraine. Her comments come as the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has arrived in the Ukrainian capital for a meeting with President Zelensky, with the goal of securing evacuation corridors for civilians trapped in besieged cities like Mariupol. Let's just have a listen to what the Foreign Secretary had to say at the Mansion House last night.
Ukraine deserves nothing less than a landmark international effort to rebuild their towns and cities, regenerate their industries, and secure their freedom for the long term. We're doubling down. We will keep going further and faster to push Russia out of the whole of Ukraine. And this has to be a catalyst for wider change. We need to apply this tough stance to the threats that are emerging beyond Ukraine.
Well, let's speak now to Sky's Mark Stone, joining us now from the Transnistria-Moldova border. Good to see you this morning, Mark. I mean, in part, the reason that you are where you are is the reason that Liz Truss is talking about pushing Vladimir Putin out of the entirety of the country. It does appear that his ambitions are not solely limited to Ukraine.
Yeah, remember, there were plenty of people who didn't believe that Vladimir Putin would go as far as he did when he attempted 8 weeks ago to take Kyiv itself. So the fact that Russian generals, that the Kremlin are talking about this potential land bridge that would bring their forces along the south of Ukraine, to bring their forces to the west of Ukraine, potentially to link up with this breakaway state of Transnistria, which is a part of Moldova, but it is self-declared independent. It's just down there. You can see beyond those two wind turbines is a vast power station. That power station is within Transnistria, and it provides all the energy for Moldova. So the Russians could quite easily cut off the supplies of energy to Moldova, as they have already done in terms of Russian gas to both Poland and Bulgaria. So there are very many different fronts in this war, literally military fronts, but also attempts by Russia to use its influence elsewhere to be able to put pressure on the West. So that is why Liz Truss is suggesting that the West needs to double down. In terms of the diplomacy, well, we know that the Secretary General of the United Nations is now in Kyiv. He's leaving right now to head to the towns of Bucha and Irpin, those towns where such horrific murder took place. It is something that the Secretary General has already talked about, and he will visit those two towns. I imagine that will be a pretty poignant moment. Later on this afternoon, he will hold meetings with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. In terms of further east, Mariupol, there are still strikes taking place there. There are still airstrikes by the Russians taking place and clashes with the Ukrainian forces in the Azovstal steelworks. That, despite the fact that Vladimir Putin said that his forces would not strike the steelworks. He told the Secretary General of the UN that when he was in Moscow, and yet on the ground the facts appear to differ. So on many fronts at the moment, there are still clashes taking place, and the language coming out of the Kremlin is particularly concerning.
Mark, whilst we have you, we constantly talk, and you've just mentioned it there, about the creation of these evacuation corridors. I mean, whenever they have been set up, they have brought out with them a fraction of the total that they have wanted. What has largely been the reason for that? Has it just been Russian obstinance?
A very good question, and it's very frustrating from our point of view because we cannot get into Mariupol. I think that's something worth stressing, is that it's not possible for Western journalists just to go there. The only way you get in is if the Kremlin allows you in from the Russian side, and that has not been happening. There are humanitarian corridors, and we've witnessed many hundreds of people who have left Mariupol over the course of the past 8 weeks, but there are many, many more who are unable to leave simply because it's not safe. And there are multiple checkpoints as you drive out of Mariupol. And remember, it's a vast, vast country, and so the journey, the distances are huge, and multiple Russian checkpoints at which very often these buses and private vehicles, if people have got them, are turned back. And so there are two distinct problems in Mariupol. There is those that are within the town, the city itself, and there are still many thousands there. And then there are those that are holed up in the steelworks. Those that are in the steelworks, they are not able to get out at all at the moment. Absolutely impossible for them to leave. Those that are in the town itself, they can get out only when humanitarian corridors are open. And the Russians are saying, oh, look, we always open them. But they open them for people to go into Russia. They don't open them all the time for people to go further west into Ukraine.
Mark, many thanks indeed. I'm very pleased to say the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace joins us once again in the programme. Good to see you this morning, Minister. I wonder if actually we might start with a quick question on where Mark was, the Transnistria and Moldova border. How concerned are you that Vladimir Putin's ambitions stretch much further than Ukraine?
Well, I think he's always had these sort of ambitions that he wrote about and spoke about for years, actually, about the Russian people or the ancient people of Rus, and that has led him to be sort of ethnic nationalist when he drives towards sort of geographic ambition. It's one of the justifications of why he thought he would be able to walk into Ukraine and be welcomed. And obviously there are pockets of other Russian speakers that he feels, potentially in the same way that, the Nazis felt in the Second World War, that they have a sort of ownership of these people. Yeah. And so there is definitely a sense that, you can see in his current statements, he is almost in desperation trying to broaden this, either with threats or indeed with potential false flags or attacks. We don't know the details of the attacks that happened yesterday in Transnistria. There are a number of players in Transnistria. There are separatists, there are Russians, everything. So we're not too sure. But, of course, it's another step, if it is Russia behind it, of another example of his strategic blunder. Because, for Romania, Moldova is incredibly important. So all you do is harden the resolve of something like Romania. We saw him switch off the gas to Bulgaria yesterday, which was a country that was sort of on the fence. Well, the consequence of that is the complete opposite.
Is this in part why the Foreign Secretary kind of alluded yesterday to the fact, this conflict, this war in Ukraine could last a number of years, it could last perhaps a decade?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that Putin, having failed in nearly all his objectives, may seek to consolidate what he's got, sort of fortify and dig in, as he did in 2014, and just be a sort of cancerous growth within the country of Ukraine and make it very hard for people to move them out of those fortified positions. So I think it's really about if we want this to not happen, we have to help Ukrainians effectively get the limpet off the rock and keep the momentum pushing them back.
But when Liz Truss says, we have to push Russia out of the whole of Ukraine, we should really need to clarify this. Is she talking about Crimea?
Well, the international community believes Russia should leave Ukraine. The international community has condemned Russia for its invasion of Crimea, which was illegal in 2014, its invasion of Donetsk, which was illegal.
Recognising it as illegal is somewhat different to
we don't
recognise
it, and we've constantly said that Russia should leave Ukraine sovereign territory. So that hasn't changed. If you remember, we did a freedom of navigation exercise with HMS Defender last year in the Black Sea. We don't recognise their ownership. So
are you contemplating a point in this conflict where we will continue to support the Ukrainians as they push into Crimea?
Well, I think, there's a long way to go before Ukraine pushes into Crimea. I think what I would certainly say is, we are supporting Ukraine's sovereign integrity. We've done that all along. That, of course, includes Crimea and Donetsk. But, first and foremost, let's get Russia out of where they are now in its invasion plans and help Ukraine resolve. And that's, if you remember, the Minsk agreement, which Russia has basically ripped up, was all about trying to resolve those two occupied territories. But the key thing here is to continue to support Ukraine's sovereign integrity and their ability to defend themselves.
It appears that you do have a bit of an ally in the Foreign Secretary, as you would expect, of course. But when she said in her speech, that 2% in terms of NATO spending should be the floor and not the ceiling. You would want more money at the moment. I'm just wondering, has the Treasury served to provide you with funds to replace the weapons and equipment that we've sent to Ukraine to cover the costs of sending troops to the border?
Yes, for now, the Treasury has absolutely reimbursed us or are reimbursing us for both the kit we're providing and indeed, the operational costs, which is what you would expect. And I think, Rishi Sunak as Chancellor definitely stood by us on those issues. So right now, in the here and now, we don't have a challenge to our funding. Of course, the future is a different thing, the effects of inflation on our budget, but also how far we want to go in support of Ukraine will, of course, have costs. But, Rishi's been incredibly supportive on that, and we're continuing on that direction.
Would you like to see more than the 2.1?
I think if you had any Secretary of State of any department sitting on your
True, but I've got you.
And asking them if they'd like more money for the department, of course I'd like more money for my department. But
what's the likelihood?
A Labour Secretary of State would say that any Secretary of State.
But you are, let's be fair about it, and you are involved in a war. And no other government department is, and you are supplying weapons and material to a war. So just on that basis, would you like to see some more?
In the right now, here and now, for this year's budget, I am absolutely set, and for next year's. We put in a bid to the Chancellor for a 4-year budget. Those first 2 years are sort of over. I have always said as the threat changes, our demands change. That can go up and down. What has changed since the integrated review and indeed the Defence Command paper is the threat has changed insofar as while we identified Russia as basically the number one threat, the fact that President Putin has gone even further does make us all in a much more insecure place. And that's why the next spending round and discussions about the budget for the defence will, of course, include how threat has changed. But right now, the reforms to the armed forces, the support Rishi's giving me for ammunition, etc., means that we're in a position where we can meet our demand.
Just reading this morning's kind of defence intelligence briefing, a focus on the Black Sea and the fleet there, and I would suggest that 20 vessels there is in part why we're considering sending, is it Brimstone?
Well, so the reporting's slightly amiss. The Brimstone we are sending is the ground Brimstone.
Right,
so
okay.
That will be used over the ground. You have to have a different type of Brimstone for maritime, but the ones we're sending at the moment are that. But we have said we will source and supply, if we can, anti-ship missiles. It's incredibly important that the grain that affects us all, the food prices, does get out of Ukraine, that the Russians can't control the Black Sea. It's not theirs anymore, that it is the Turks and the Romanians, the Bulgarians, but they think somehow they can control it. And therefore making sure that the Russian ships are not used to bombard cities is important. The Minister, whenever we speak, generally we spend the vast majority of our time on your brief. Today there are a couple of other stories around that I think demand a little bit of attention. The High Court ruling yesterday in its judicial review of the unlawful nature of the decision taken by Matt Hancock as regards care homes. Is it finally time for us to dispose of the notion, as he himself said, that there was any sort of a protective ring thrown around care homes? Well, I think that let's cast our mind back, and this is really important to remember. I remember, certainly, again in the defence space, but there was a clamour for assistance. We were learning incredibly fast about this virus. It was coming thick and fast. There were massive concerns about the scale of infection, the death rates. If you remember, about the same time, everyone wanted ventilators. The medical advice was ventilators what would be needed. I remember using the military to unpack thousands of ventilators that came in from around the world, and then consequently we learned that was not really the key part of the treatment. So that's why we're having this big public inquiry. That's why we're going to have an inquiry into COVID. It's really important we learn those lessons. Of course, that is a court case and a court ruling. Matt Hancock's put his own statement out saying... Yeah, he has. I mean, he said that the court case comprehensively clears ministers of any wrongdoing. The judgment said that those in charge had simply failed. I mean... I've went through, I don't know if you've had the time to read the 75-page judgment. I did. I read it last night. And despite Mr Hancock's characterisation of it comprehensively clearing ministers, it clearly states that he acted unlawfully. And in doing so, in not paying heed to asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19, people died in care homes. Well, look, we've been very clear that we apologise for all deaths in this that could have been better handled. I know Matt did his own interview recently saying he had some regrets. But look, fundamentally... I bet he does. Well, look. Imagine if we'd kept asymmetric people in hospital. What would that have done to other patients as well? I mean, this was not a... Yes, it happened in a care home setting. We took a lot of steps around care homes. If you remember, we got criticised not so long ago for insisting that you had to be vaccinated to work in a care home. There was a huge amount of criticism. I wouldn't say there was as much criticism of the decision to send people potentially with COVID-19 into one of the most risky environments for COVID transmission. I mean, the Prime Minister repeated this statement yesterday at Prime Minister's Questions, that the government had not been told by Public Health England about asymptomatic transmission. I mean, that is just nonsense. I want to show you a quote from Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor. And he says this. He was on the Today programme on March the 13th that year. He said, it looks quite likely that there is some degree of asymptomatic transmission. There's definitely quite a lot of transmission very early on in the disease when there are very mild symptoms. He was talking about it. I knew about it. My colleagues here at Sky News knew about it. For the Prime Minister and indeed the Health Secretary to maintain that they knew nothing about it because Public Health England didn't give them an explicit warning. I mean, it's just this court case proves that not to be true. Well, look, I think, as I've said, there is going to be an inquiry so we can actually see the whole thing in context. We can study what you're saying about whether the Prime Minister and others were told. We can see whether they acted on it. I certainly remember using military personnel to try and take testing to care homes so we could make sure we... no one is denying that the armed forces played a key role. No, but it's not just about the armed forces. The point was the government did recognise there were issues in care homes, which is why they asked the army, for example, to assist that. I think, look, there's a court case. I haven't read the 75-page ruling. Definitely the welfare of people in this country is top of my agenda. The Prime Minister misled the House yesterday when he said that he did not know about asymptomatic transmission. That was his Chief Scientific Advisor there. Well, look, they just switched on the Today programme, and I'm not suggesting people do, but, Well, I think, first and foremost, what I would say is that quote doesn't talk about asymmetric, it says mild symptoms, right? So some people have no symptoms who had COVID. I will read it. I will read it again. It looks quite likely there is some degree of asymptomatic transmission. Yeah. Well, look. I haven't read the report. Sure. I've just come on the programme. I fully understand. It's a 75-page report. Matt Hancock's put a statement out. We're having a full inquiry to get to the bottom of all the lessons learned, to have a look at what happened. But I need to just take you and your viewers back to remember those stages. Well, it was unknown. No one knew about the variants. You know, we were learning fast and furiously about exactly what to do. And there were many situations that were almost lose-lose. If you were damned if you did, and you were damned if you didn't. Yeah. And I think it's really important to remember that, you know, the government was also grappling at the time with, do we have enough PPE? Do we have enough ventilators? Do we have all those things? Some of those things turned out to be the wrong course of effort, based on advice or based on no advice because there wasn't any. And I think we should just not forget the mass worry in the state of the pandemic.
And, of course, you are not Matt Hancock. There is, of course, a standing invitation if Mr Hancock wants to come on and explain himself. But I do want to ask about perhaps one of the most ridiculous stories I have heard in recent times, that a Conservative colleague of yours was caught sitting in the House of Commons chamber next to, apparently, a female minister watching pornography.
Well, look, there is no place for pornography in any workplace. I mean, people are there to do their job. And, you know, I know that the Chief Whip has referred that complaint to the panel or the conduct authority, and look, we'll look into that. And if there's any action to be done, then there should be action taken. I don't think there's any excuse. You don't sit in your workplace looking at pornography. That's...
Well, your colleague, Damien Green, did. That's what got him sacked from Cabinet.
Well, there was a result. There was an outcome.
No, I'm just saying, if any party has formed for this, it's the Conservatives.
Well, I used to... hang on a sec. I used to... when I was Security Minister, my office in the House of Commons was John Prescott's old office, where he had his Christmas party. He was the deputy leader of the Labour Party, and if we all remember that wasn't pornography, that was something else that went on in that room. I used to wonder if it was the same desk. So, you know, I think let's just be clear here. Same with sexual conduct. There's a range of allegations that go right across the House, go right across the parties. You know, this is a problem, I think, about the overall culture of the House of Commons. It is late sitting, long nights, with bars, and that very often leads, and it has done for decades, to behavioural challenges and problems, whether that's too much drink. We've remembered reports of, you know...
Well, why do the armed forces deal with this stuff better than, you know, our elected representatives?
Well, we still have problems in the armed forces. I mean, you know, look, one of the main missions of me as Defence Secretary is we need to make the armed forces far better for women and their service. We need to look after complaints. We need to take those complaints seriously and action them better. We need to make sure we recruit more women and make sure it's childcare friendly for families in the army. All those sort of things are really important. So, you know, I wouldn't say make that comparison. What I would say is, you know, we all know what happens when you mix long hours, drink, and pressure environment. And I think it's really important that we think about ways to change the culture in the House of Commons so it doesn't happen.
Minister, great to have you in the programme. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Shall we have a quick look through the front pages of the papers? And we start this morning with the Eye. It leads with the High Court ruling criticising the government for discharging COVID patients to care homes during the pandemic. Well, here is the Metro. We've just been discussing this story. Reports that an as yet unnamed Conservative MP watched pornography on his mobile phone in the Commons chamber. A number of female colleagues have complained. The Times has the comments from the Foreign Secretary that the war in Ukraine could last for years, and indeed that President Putin may choose to use weapons of mass destruction to break the deadlock. The Financial Times says that the price of gas in Europe has risen by another 10% after Russia's decision to turn off supplies to Poland and Bulgaria. And the Mail claims an exclusive with news that police may yet hold a full inquiry into allegations that Labour leader Keir Starmer broke lockdown rules when he was filmed drinking with party officials. Loads coming up on the show this morning. I'll be speaking to the chairman of the Health and Social Care Committee, this man, Jeremy Hunt, getting his reaction to yesterday's care homes ruling, as well as on reforming the NHS compensation scheme. I'll be speaking to the boss of the company that owns the steel plant in the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol, where the city's last defenders and some civilians still remain. And just after 8, we'll be getting the views of the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth. Now, a Home Office minister has told Sky News that a Conservative MP who allegedly watched pornography on his mobile phone in the Commons chamber should be expelled from the party if the claims are true. The government's chief whip has launched an investigation into the allegations, and it has been referred to Parliament's independent complaints and grievance scheme. Rachel Maclean, who is the minister responsible for safeguarding women, says the alleged behaviour is both shocking and unacceptable.
I don't know the name, but the Chief Whip, of course, is going to... Of course, he's investigating it already. He's already said that. He said that as soon as the allegation was made. Action needs to be taken. I very much hope that this person will see him out of Parliament, out of the party.
So you think that he'll be out... You'd like to see him out of Parliament?
I would hope that's where we get to. But, I mean, of course, we have to hear the full facts of the case. We've only heard one side of the story, but that's already starting to happen. But I just want to be clear, it's completely and utterly shocking and unacceptable.
Also making the news, a 50-year-old man is to appear in court this morning, charged with the murder of a missing mother of two, Katie Kenyon. A huge search operation is still underway in Gisborne Forest to try and find the 33-year-old. Katie's sister said the family have lost a mum, a daughter, a sister, an auntie, a niece, a granddaughter and a friend. Councillors in York have unanimously voted to revoke Prince Andrew's Freedom of the City status after his legal settlement over allegations of sexual abuse. The honour was given as a wedding present back in 1987. Both Buckingham Palace and a spokesman for the Duke declined to comment. The government will today set out plans to sell Channel 4, the publicly owned but commercially funded broadcaster established in the 1980s. This will be included in proposed reforms to decades-old broadcasting regulations to put traditional broadcasters on an even playing field with the streaming networks. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has warned energy companies could face a windfall tax on profits if they don't support the economy by increasing investment in energy security. In a wide-ranging interview with Mumsnet, he hinted there could be further help for families struggling with soaring energy bills in the autumn. A Minnesota state agency says it will work with the city of Minneapolis to resolve the pattern of race discrimination uncovered by a 2-year investigation. It was launched after George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis police officer. The report found a pattern of race discrimination lasting at least the past decade. The court in the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard defamation trial saw a bizarre deposition from the former couple's concierge. The actor is suing his ex-wife for $50 million for a domestic abuse article she wrote in the Washington Post, which never actually mentioned him. She's counter-suing for $100 million. Sky's Claire Gregory has been taking a look.
Sweets, sketchbooks and smiles on the way in. But a serious tone in court.
We just need to come in and make sure that everybody's okay.
Body cam footage was shown of police officers responding to a call in May 2016. Apparently, their last row before they broke up, one was asked about red marks on the actress's face.
Knowing what our investigation revealed, no, that pink's consistent with Brian.
Johnny Depp and Amber Heard's former agent gave evidence. Christian Carino says after playing Captain Jack Sparrow 5 times in the Pirates of the Caribbean films, he believes the actor lost the role in the upcoming 6th movie because of Amber Heard's allegations of abuse.
I don't recall whether either of us ever said anything specific about why, but it is something within the industry that is understood.
Another witness seems so fed up he gave his testimony while driving.
I'm tired. I don't want to deal with this court case. Everybody got problems, and I don't want to deal with this no more.
That was a first. I'm sorry.
But with several weeks to go, there'll be plenty more people dragged grudgingly into this messy legal battle. Claire Gregory, Sky News.
Time for a quick look at the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
High pressure stays close to Britain and Ireland throughout the bank holiday weekend, keeping conditions largely settled and weakening a rain belt that's moving south on Saturday. It's a cold start to the day, a frost in plenty of the rural parts. Cloudier conditions in the east will mean a milder start there. Through the morning, the best of the sunshine will be in the west, with temperatures recovering to near-average values. Scotland's central belt and the northeast, along with Scotland, Britain, will become quite warm, with a daytime high of 16 or 17 Celsius, 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds light for most, but southernmost counties and the southwest likely to be quite breezy.
To fly.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Now, who's in the mood for something out of this world? Well, this is the moment that 4 new astronauts arrived at the International Space Station on a mission between NASA and SpaceX. It is the first NASA crew comprised equally of men and women, and includes Jessica Watkins, the first black woman making a long-term stint in space. But let's take a look at some of the pictures around today. This is fantastic. There's an animal theme linking all of them this morning. First up, we have this truly terrifying picture in the Times. Crowned Underwater Photographer of the Year, Lewis Jeffreys managed to snap a shot of this, well, magnificent, you could also insert scary, compass jellyfish. Where is it? Somewhere presumably in the Caribbean? Nah, it's off the coast of Falmouth in Cornwall, so good luck, guys. Next up, The Telegraph. Well, it has a picture of a cow in a face mask. It's great, this. No, it's not trying to avoid COVID. It's actually a new invention designed to capture the methane that's released when the cow burps. A very amusing way to reduce global warming. I'd have thought it would have been better on the other end. Finally, though, from one farm animal to another, with this picture in today's Daily Mail. Firefighters were forced to get creative after 5 sheep, we're only picturing, oh no, we are, 1, 2, you can just make out the 4th one in the middle there, that were stuck on a rooftop in West Yorkshire. Luckily, they were able to shepherd the flock back down to safety. Still ahead, I'm going to be joined by the chair of the Commons Health and Social Care Committee and, of course, former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt, a group of MPs calling for the NHS compensation scheme to be radically overhauled. That's next. Welcome back. Let me just remind you as to our top stories. And the Foreign Secretary says that Russia must be completely driven out of Ukraine. Comments backed up by the Defence Secretary a little earlier in the programme. There are calls for an unnamed Conservative MP to be expelled from the party if it's true that he watched pornography whilst sitting in the House of Commons chamber. Parliament's Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme has been asked to investigate. And police in Lancashire have charged a 50-year-old man with the murder of missing mother of 2, Katie Kenyon. A search operation is still underway in Gisborne Forest. Katie's sister said the family have lost a mum, a daughter, a sister, an auntie, a niece, a granddaughter, and a friend. Well, as mentioned a little earlier, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace told me a desperate Vladimir Putin was trying to broaden the war.
Well, I think it's certainly the case that Putin, having failed in nearly all his objectives, may seek to consolidate what he's got, sort of fortify and dig in, as he did in 2014, and just be a sort of cancerous growth within the country of Ukraine and make it very hard for people to move them out of those fortified positions. So I think it's really about if we want this to not happen, we have to help the Ukrainians effectively get the limpet off the rock and keep the momentum pushing them back.
Guys, Ali Fortescue is with us in the studio. Good to see you this morning. I mean, in part, Ben Wallace was giving that answer because of comments made by Liz Truss, suggesting that this conflict and potentially our involvement could be lasting years.
Yeah, that's right. He said that we could be in for the long haul. I think there were 2 really interesting parts of his answer. The first was echoing really what Liz Truss said last night. He said that the sovereignty of Ukraine, that they support it so much that, of course, includes Crimea. So that's quite a thing to suggest that potentially we're looking at taking back Crimea, which, of course, was annexed by Russia back in 2014. The second interesting thing was about the defence budget. Liz Truss last night suggesting 2% should be a floor, not a ceiling. He said at the moment he is happy with the budget, but suggested that things could change quite quickly. Things like inflation might change. But he, I think, was more measured than we saw Liz Truss last night on that.
Potentially. Ali, for now, much more. Thank you very much. Much more from Ali Fortescue later on in the programme. Now, the NHS compensation scheme is not fit for purpose, according to a report by MPs, who say that the system needs to be radically overhauled. They say under the current scheme, accessing compensation is slow, adversarial, stressful and often bitter. Joining us now, the chairman of the Commons Health and Social Care Committee and, of course, former Health Secretary himself, Jeremy Hunt. Mr Hunt, lovely to have you on the programme. I wonder if we might just start by giving an overview of the committee's conclusions. I mean, it's been pretty clear for some time that there needed to be some reform of NHS litigation.
Thank you. Good morning, Neil. This might seem a rather sort of technical area, And it's very important to say from the outset that the vast majority of NHS care is absolutely excellent, totally safe. But when things do go wrong, we're very bad at learning from mistakes and making sure the same thing doesn't happen again in the future. And one of the reasons is the litigation system we have, which can mean that families have to wait 5, 6, 7 years before they actually get an answer as to whether they're going to get any compensation. It's absolutely devastating for them. And it costs the NHS over £2 billion every year to pay these claims. The biggest hospital in the NHS is Bart's Trust. That's more than the entire annual cost of paying for every single doctor and nurse in Bart's, that we're paying in compensation, in litigation costs, rather than on frontline care. And that's why we're saying there needs to be an urgent overhaul.
What then, in your mind, needs to be done? I mean, you're absolutely right to say that, lessons haven't been learnt in the past. You only need to look as far as the Ockenden report for that. So what needs to be done and be done pretty quickly?
The first thing we say is that the priority needs to be to learn from mistakes. And to do that, we need to make it much easier for patients to get compensation. Ironically, if you make it easier for people to get compensation, you learn from mistakes and it ends up costing you less because these things don't then happen again a few months or years later. And we looked at systems in New Zealand and in Sweden, which actually end up costing their health systems about half what it costs us here in the NHS. And that's because they just make it easier for people to access compensation. Here, you have to prove that a doctor or a nurse has been clinically negligent before you get any compensation. And what that means is you have a very adversarial process right from the start. The medics feel very, very defensive. They don't want to talk openly because they're worried that there may be professional consequences for them. And right from the outset, you get a very negative atmosphere when actually what everyone wants to do is to be completely transparent about what happened, learn the mistakes, and make sure these terrible tragedies aren't repeated.
And this is the thing, isn't it? Ultimately, at the core of this, the NHS, held up by everyone, well, pretty much everyone in this country, as one of the things that we are so most proud of to be British. It also has to be mentioned that mistakes are made, mistakes are compounded by cover-ups. I just wonder whether or not you think that the system is hindered or it benefits from the kind of the decentralised control of the health service by giving control to kind of the NHS Trust. Is there more or less of an attempt by individual hospitals to cover up their mistakes?
Well, it's a very good question. I'm generally in favour of giving more autonomy to hospitals and GP surgeries just to get on with the job. But I think in this case, the law gets in the way and it makes it very difficult. If someone wants to, if you're a doctor or a nurse and something goes wrong, the first thing you want to do is to be honest with the families about what happened, to be completely open about it. But your lawyers are telling you, if you do that, you could be hauled in front of the General Medical Council, you could lose your licence to practice, you could cost us huge amounts of money. And there's one other thing that is really outrageous in the law and really against the founding principles of the NHS, which is that if the child of a banker is severely disabled because of a mistake, they will get more compensation than the child of a cleaner. Because extraordinarily, the way the law works is it looks at the likely future earnings of that child and it decides that the child of the banker would have been likely to earn more in the future. That, to me, goes right against the founding principle of equality that underlines the way the NHS works, and we should change that as well.
I wonder, Mr. Hunt, if we can kind of stay on your brief, such as it is, but get your kind of experience as a former health secretary. And of course, you know where I'm going with this. The High Court decision, the High Court judicial review yesterday of Matt Hancock's decision to move elderly people from hospitals into care homes. The Prime Minister said yesterday at PMQs that the government wasn't told of concerns about asymptomatic transmission by Public Health England, and that's nonsense, isn't it?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that to be Prime Minister or Health Secretary in a pandemic is an incredibly challenging thing. You're having to make decisions very quickly and you are going to make some mistakes. And I think we have to be reasonable and think about the context that Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson were operating in. Our Select Committee looked at this report in detail and we concluded, similarly to yesterday's judgment, that we should have done much more to learn from what happened in countries like Germany and Hong Kong, where when people were sent to care homes, for example, in Germany, they had to be isolated for 3 months unless there was a negative test. We didn't do that here. That was clearly a mistake. But I think the broader issue, and it's one that I have to bear my share of responsibility for as well as someone who was Health Secretary for 6 years, is that we just still have not sorted out the problems in the social care system. So when you have a crisis, it always ends up playing second fiddle to the NHS. The focus of, if I may say, Neil, also the media, but the politicians, the civil servants, the system is on hospitals and hospital care. And that's what everyone is thinking about. And what happened?
I would counter that we probably wouldn't have known as quickly as we did what was going on in our care homes if it wasn't for the media, including people like our People in Politics correspondent Nick Martin getting in there. I mean, the problem is, I suppose, Mr. Hunt, is we can't deal with this as an abstraction. You know, by June of 2020, there were perhaps as many as 30,000 excess deaths in care homes. And in part, that was as a result of a decision taken by the then Health Secretary, seemingly unaware of advice that if he'd switched on the Today programme, he'd have heard Sir Patrick Vallance giving.
Yes, I'm sorry, I wasn't saying that the media didn't have a very, very important role during the...
I was being somewhat cheeky. I was being somewhat cheeky, Mr. Hunt.
But I think the interesting thing is, actually, if you look at the High Court judgment, the advice the Health Secretary received from officials didn't advise him that he should think about this question of asymptomatic transmission. So there was a kind of groupthink in the system that said that this virus we were dealing with was going to be essentially like the flu virus, where you don't think so much about asymptomatic transmission. I think there are lots and lots of lessons to be learned, but the broader point I really wanted to make is that until we really fix the problems in the care system, then I think we're always going to find the centre of gravity in a crisis remains hospitals and the NHS. And that, in this case, had devastating consequences.
Mr. Hunt, away from health entirely, what do you make of the reports that one of your parliamentary colleagues, one of your Conservative Party colleagues, I should actually say, was seen by his colleagues watching pornography on his mobile phone in the House of Commons chamber?
Well, to be honest, I just feel so disappointed. I'm disappointed that it was someone in my party that was alleged to have done this, but also disappointed for the House of Commons as an institution. I have to say my day-to-day experience as an MP is not that this kind of thing is happening on a regular basis, but I just feel we should not be putting female MPs through this kind of ordeal. It is totally and utterly unacceptable, and clearly we have to have a very big culture change, and and I hope if there is some good that comes out of this, it will prompt that culture change that many people have been calling for.
Jeremy Hunt, always great to have you on the programme. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
A little bit of breaking news for you now. We're just learning that a man has been charged with 4 murders in South London. Aged 28, Joshua Jacks has been charged with the murder of 4 family members stabbed to death in that terraced house in Bermondsey, according to the Metropolitan Police. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, has vowed that his special military operation in Ukraine will guarantee the safety of people in the Donbass and Crimea. But his forces continue their assault on the Donetsk region. Our correspondent Alex Rossi sent this report from the town of Severodonetsk that finds itself under, near continuous bombardment.
There is absolutely nowhere here that's been spared. Street after street, it's the same. Shattered buildings and bomb craters. The frontline city of Severodonetsk is a key target for Russian forces. And it's been under attack since day one of this invasion. The people here survive on handouts. There's no power or running water. Most have left, and those staying only come up from their basements when the shelling stops. At the main police station, the Ukrainian flag still flies proudly. This building's been targeted again and again, but the resistance remains strong.
This is the second floor of the police building. It's still very much under Ukrainian control, but this area is heavily contested at the moment. And there isn't really any part of this city that hasn't been hit by Russian attacks. This was an airstrike. Now, nobody was killed, incredibly, and the police are managing to still work out of the rest of this building. But it's a scene of absolute devastation.
Everyone in this city is struggling in the face of unrelenting savagery.
You can hear the shelling in the distance.
As we visit the only working hospital, the sound of fighting gets closer. Inside, the medics do what they can. They're treating the war wounded and routine emergencies. People don't stop getting sick because there's shooting outside. All of the patients are treated in the corridors, away from the windows which have been blown out by shells. This hospital's been attacked more than 20 times. Lyubov Pavlivna is recovering from shrapnel wounds, but she's defiant and has this message for Vladimir Putin.
А чтобы они погибли, чтобы их гадов и близко не было подонков таких, сколько они. Мало того, что они наше население и молодых ребят, военных уничтожили, так они ж подлюки своих уничтожают. Смерть ему и больше ничего, ему и всем его приближенным.
And after we left, we received these images from medics. The hospital had been shelled again, and one of the patients was killed. It is another reminder of the brutal nature of Russia's war, where the innocent are all too often the victims. Alex Rossi, Sky News, Eastern Ukraine.
Potentially thousands of civilians and troops remained trapped in a steel plant in Ukraine. The Azovstal complex, it's situated in the besieged city of Mariupol in the south of Ukraine. Local officials say the plant is once again under Russian bombardment. Joining me now, Yuri Ryzhenkov, the CEO of Metinvest Holding, which owns the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. Yuri, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us this morning. I really appreciate it. I just wonder if you can give us any up-to-date information on what you know to be the situation in and around the steel plant. You must suspect that there are several thousand of your employees still there.
Well, unfortunately, we don't even know how many of our employees are still at the plant. The situation there is, I would say, humanitarian catastrophe. The food and water that was prepared by us in the shelters is probably over. And the Russians, since the beginning of the war, did not allowing people to leave safely the place. Despite their announcement of so-called green corridors, they never worked. So whenever people tried to get out, they were shot at. So I think it's a real tragedy which is happening there right now.
Yeah, as we just look at pictures of the kind of bombarded steel plant, you looking at, I don't know if you can see these pictures, but you will have seen the damage that has been done to your resource. I just heard you mention, though, that there was you had stocked food and water at the plant in advance of the Russian invasion.
That's correct. We've been in contact with the Russian invasion since 2014. One of our factories in Avdiivka has been close to the dividing line for a long time. So we always kept the bomb shelters in good order. We always kept at least two to 3 weeks stocks of food and water there. That allowed people of Mariupol to stay there for such a long time.
How long in terms of food and water did you think that you had in stocks at the steel plant? Of course, this has been going on now for in excess of 60, 70 days, I think.
That's correct. Well, specifically, Azovstal has bomb shelters enough to give cover to about 4,000 people. And we stocked food and water, which is enough with the normal ration for about 3 weeks. But now, as you rightly said, it's almost 2 months, and I'm pretty sure that the stocks are running out.
When was the last time that you had any direct contact with people at the steel plant, Yuri?
Well, the last direct contact was some time ago when we still had some of our employees with satellite phones and they were able to contact us. But we're daily meeting some people that managed to get out at their own risk from the plant and get out of Mariupol and get to our help centers, to our rehabilitation centers in Zaporozhye. And we're talking to them and they're telling us the stories, what's happening there.
What happens if the worst happens in your mind, Yuri? If the Russians do manage to take Mariupol and, of course, take the steel plant, what then happens to any employees of yours that are theirs? I mean, can you see yourselves working under Russian occupation?
Well, we always proclaimed, and our shareholder, Rinat Akhmetov, he already said that repeatedly, that we will not work under the Russian occupation. Medinvest as a company or none of SCM group companies will work under the Russian occupation. That goes for Mariupol as well. I hope that as many as possible our employees will get out of this occupied city. We are greeting them in Zaporozhye. We have a rehabilitation center. We have providing them with the food, with the clothes, with the psychiatrists, and also we're providing with a new place of work. So hopefully as many as possible of our employees will get out of there.
Yuri, I wonder if we might just speak more generally about the conflict that you have seen. I just wonder what your views are of the Russians, of Vladimir Putin, given what has happened in Mariupol, given what has happened in Bucha, Kharkiv, in so many places in and around Ukraine.
I mean, seeing what I've seen there is very difficult to express the words what I think about them. But I'm pretty sure that by doing so, Mr. Putin has made a huge damage to Ukraine, but he destroyed Russia. And the Russian, for generations, they will pay for that.
Do you see a peaceful end to this conflict anytime soon, given, well, the latest that we are hearing is that Vladimir Putin's ambitions might not be limited, of course, just to Ukraine. Moldova is now starting to look slightly concerning.
That's correct, but we already see the world uniting around Ukraine to basically to stop this Russian aggression. And I mean, we've learned from the Second World War, when the world unites, none of the aggressors ever able to win.
Yuri Rzhenkov, thank you so much for talking to us this time. We do hope that your employees are safe and well in those bunkers.
Thank you very much.
We're just looking ahead to events taking place later on today. In about half an hour's time, we are expecting the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, to hold her weekly news briefing. We would expect some lines coming from that, given that she was the person, along with Vladimir Putin, threatening the UK directly for, as she saw it, James Heapy earlier this week, encouraging the Ukrainians to strike targets inside Russia. Indeed, stay where you are. After the break, I will be bringing you all the latest from Ukraine. Another key event today, the head of the UN arriving in the Ukrainian capital for talks with Volodymyr Zelensky.